Sherlock Holmes and the Red Circle by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, on the 22nd of May, 1859. When he was a young boy, he liked reading books. In 1876, he began studying medicine at Edinburgh University. One of his professors was Dr. Joseph Bell. Dr. Bell watched his patients closely so that he could understand their illness. Later, Dr. Bell became Conan Doyle's model for Sherlock Holmes. In 1882, Conan Doyle became a doctor. He did not have many patients, so he began writing his first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, 1887. The story was a big success. In 1891, he wrote Sherlock Holmes stories for a monthly magazine called The Strand. Soon, the clever detective and his friend Dr. Watson became very popular in Great Britain. When Conan Doyle stopped writing Sherlock Holmes stories, his readers got angry. Finally, in 1901, he started writing another Sherlock Holmes adventure, called The Hound of the Baskervilles. A lot of other stories followed. His readers were very pleased, and he continued writing about the famous detective until 1927. Some famous Sherlock Holmes books are The Sign of Four, 1890, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, 1892, The Return of Sherlock Holmes, 1905, The Valley of Fear, 1915, and The Case Book of Sherlock Holmes, 1927. The Red Circle is part of the book His Last Bow, 1917. Conan Doyle died in England on the 7th of July, 1930.
Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. The story you are going to read takes place in London at the start of the 20th century. It is about London's famous fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes, and his good friend, Dr. Watson. Dr. Watson helps Holmes with his detective cases. When Sherlock Holmes moved to London in 1874, he did not have much money, and his family had to help him. In 1881, he decided to share the cost of his rooms at 221B Baker Street with Dr. John H. Watson. And this is how Holmes and Watson became good friends. Watson tells us a lot of things about Holmes. He is not a difficult person to live with because he is quiet and has regular habits. For example, he usually goes to bed around 10 at night and gets up very early in the morning. He works on his cases with a lot of energy, but sometimes he gets very bored and sits in the living room and does nothing. Watson also tells us that he is untidy and his desk is always full of papers. Mrs. Hudson is the housekeeper who tidies the rooms. We know that Holmes plays the violin and wears Persian slippers at home. He often uses chemistry equipment to help him solve cases. Holmes is an excellent detective, and he often surprises Watson with his solutions to difficult cases.
Chapter 1. Mrs. Warren's Problem.
Well, Mrs. Warren, I'm sorry, but I can't help you. I have other things to do,
said Sherlock Holmes, looking at the papers on his desk. But Mrs. Warren did not go away.
You helped my lodger, Mr. Hobbs, last year,
said Mrs. Warren, looking at Holmes.
Yes, I remember,
said Holmes.
Mr. Hobbs said you are a kind, helpful man. Why can't you help me?
Asked Mrs. Warren. Holmes looked at her and said,
All right, Mrs. Warren, tell me about your problem. I understand your new lodger always stays in his rooms and you never see him. There's nothing strange about that.
But I'm really afraid and I can't sleep,
said Mrs. Warren.
I hear his quick footsteps from morning to night, but I never see him. Why is he hiding? My husband is worried too, but he is away all day at work. I'm alone at home with the girl who helps me clean, and I'm very frightened.
Holmes looked at her kindly and said,
Please sit down, Mrs. Warren. Now, if I decide to help you, I must know everything. Do you understand? The smallest thing can be the most important. You said that the man came 10 days ago and paid you for 2 weeks. Is that correct?
Yes,
said Mrs. Warren.
I asked him to pay £2 a week for a small sitting room and a bedroom at the top of the house.
Well?
Asked Holmes.
He said, I'll pay you £5 a week if I can have the rooms on my conditions. I'm a poor woman, sir, and Mr. Warren doesn't make much money. I needed the extra money. The man gave me £10 and said, I can give you £10 every 2 weeks for a long time on my conditions.
What were his conditions?
Asked Holmes.
Well, he wanted a key to the house, and that was all right. Lodgers often want a key. And he did not want anyone to disturb him.
There is nothing strange about that, Mrs. Warren,
said Holmes.
No, but I never see him. No one sees him. He only went out of the house on the first night.
Oh, he went out on the first night?
Asked Holmes.
Yes, sir, and he came back very late when we were all in bed,
said Mrs. Warren.
But his meals?
Asked Holmes.
Oh, we leave his meals on a chair outside his room when he rings the bell,
said Mrs. Warren.
And he rings again when he finishes eating. If he wants anything, he writes it in capital letters on a piece of paper and leaves it on the chair.
He writes in capital letters?
Asked Holmes.
Yes, sir, just the word in pencil and nothing more,
said Mrs. Warren.
Look, here are the notes he writes. This one says soap. Here's another one that says match. And this is one he wrote this morning. It says Daily Gazette. I leave the newspaper with his breakfast every morning.
Mrs. Warren gave Holmes the 2 pieces of paper, and he looked at them with interest.
Oh dear, Watson,
said Holmes.
This is really a bit strange. Why does this man write in capital letters? It is much easier and quicker to write normally. What do you think, Watson?
He probably doesn't want Mrs. Warren to see his handwriting, I said.
But why?
Asked Holmes.
Perhaps you're right, Watson. But why are his messages so short? Why doesn't he write in sentences?
I really don't know, I said. Chapter 2. Secret Messages. Holmes looked at the 2 pieces of paper carefully.
This is interesting,
he said.
He writes the words with a violet-coloured pencil. Mrs. Warren, you said that the man is not tall or short and has dark hair and a beard. How old is he?
He's young, sir, not over 30,
said Mrs. Warren.
Can you tell me something more about him?
Asked Holmes.
He spoke good English, but I'm sure he is a foreigner,
said Mrs. Warren.
Was he well dressed?
Asked Holmes.
Yes, he was very well dressed in dark clothes,
Answered Mrs. Warren.
Did he tell you his name?
Asked Holmes.
No, sir,
Answered Mrs. Warren.
Does he receive any letters or friends?
Asked Holmes.
No, sir,
Answered Mrs. Warren.
Do you, or the girl, go into his room to clean it?
Asked Holmes.
No, sir, he does it,
Said Mrs. Warren.
Goodness,
Said Holmes.
that is surprising. Did he have any luggage?
He only had one big brown bag with him,
Said Mrs. Warren.
We have to know more about him.
Said Holmes.
Did anything come out of that room?
Mrs. Warren took an envelope out of her bag and put it on the table. Inside the envelope there were 2 burnt matches and a cigarette stub.
They were on his tray this morning,
she said.
I know that small things are important to you, Mr. Holmes.
Holmes picked them up and examined them.
The matches aren't important, I think. He used them to light cigarettes. But this cigarette stub is very strange. You said the man has a beard.
Yes, he does,
said Mrs. Warren.
I don't understand,
said Holmes.
How can a man with a beard smoke a cigarette in that way? He will burn his beard. The cigarette stub is too short. Perhaps there are 2 people in the room, Mrs. Warren?
Oh, no, he eats very little, not even enough for 1 person,
said Mrs. Warren.
At this point, I think we must wait for a few more facts,
said Holmes.
After all, he paid the rent and he does not cause trouble. If he wants to hide, it is not your business, Mrs. Warren. We can't disturb him until there is a good reason. Now, I have a good picture of your problem. Please tell me if anything new happens.
Thank you, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson,
said Mrs. Warren, leaving the room.
Well, Watson, there are certainly some interesting things in this case,
said Holmes.
I think the person in the rooms is probably not the one who rented them.
Why? I asked, surprised.
Well, first of all, there is the cigarette stub,
said Holmes.
And then the lodger went out only once after he rented the rooms. He came back, or someone came back, when everyone in the house was sleeping. Was the person who went out the same person who came back late at night? We don't know. The man who rented the rooms spoke English well, but the other person wrote match and not matches. This person probably does not know English well, and that is why he writes short notes. Yes, Watson, I think the person in the rooms is not the same person who rented them.
How strange, I said.
Well, there is one thing we can do to find out more,
said Holmes.
The person in Mrs. Warren's rooms is alone and does not receive any letters or friends. How can he receive any news or messages from outside? Only by an advertisement in a newspaper. There is no other way. And we even know the newspaper. The Daily Gazette.
Holmes opened a big book where he put the personal advertisement sections of the London newspapers.
Here are the Daily Gazette personal advertisements of the last 2 weeks. Lady with blue hat at Piccadilly Circus. Jimmy, don't break your mother's heart. These don't interest me. Listen to this. I will find a way to send you messages. For now, this column, G. Look at the date of the newspaper. It's 2 days after Mrs. Warren's lodger rented the rooms. This mysterious person understands English, even if he cannot write it. Perhaps we can find more,
said Holmes.
Yes. Look, 3 days later. Take care, the clouds will pass. G. There is nothing for another week, and then another message. If I send a message, remember the secret code. 1A, 2B, and so on. You will hear from me soon, G. That was yesterday's paper, and there is nothing in today's. It could be the lodger. Let's wait a bit, Watson. We'll know more soon.
Chapter 3. The Face in the Mirror. The next morning, Holmes was sitting at his desk with a big smile on his face.
Listen to this, Watson,
he said, reading the newspaper aloud.
Tall, red house with white windows. 3rd floor, 2nd window on left, after dark. G. This is a clear message. After breakfast, we'll go and visit Mrs. Warren's house.
Good idea, I said. We got to Mrs. Warren's house and we waited for her in the sitting room. She suddenly ran into the room and said angrily,
I must call the police, Mr. Holmes, but I wanted to talk to you first. That man must leave this house. Something terrible happened to my husband this morning.
What happened to Mr. Warren?
asked Holmes.
This morning he went to work before 7 o'clock. He walked down the road a few steps and suddenly 2 men came up behind him. They threw a coat over his head and pushed him into a cab. They drove around for an hour and then opened the door and pushed him out on Hampstead Heath. When he got home, the poor man was very frightened, and now he's sleeping upstairs.
Very interesting,
said Holmes.
Did he see the men? Did he hear them speak?
No, he didn't,
said Mrs. Warren.
but he thinks there were 2 or 3 men.
And do you think this has something to do with your lodger?
asked Holmes.
Of course,
said Mrs. Warren.
My husband never had such a problem before. I don't want that lodger in this house. Money isn't everything.
Wait a moment, please,
said Holmes.
I think your lodger is in some kind of danger. Those men were probably waiting for him outside your door this morning. They thought your husband was the lodger because it was still dark at that time. When they discovered it was the wrong man, they let your husband go.
What must I do?
asked Mrs. Warren.
I want to see your lodger,
said Holmes.
But how can you see him?
asked Mrs. Warren.
No one can see him.
He has to open the door and take the tray with his meal into his room. Watson and I can hide and watch him do it.
Mrs. Warren thought for a moment and said,
Yes, you can. There's a small cupboard near his room, and I can put up a mirror. And if you are behind the door...
Excellent idea,
said Holmes.
When does he eat lunch?
At about 1 o'clock.
Good,
said Holmes.
Dr. Watson and I will come to your house before 1 o'clock. Goodbye, Mrs. Warren.
At 12:30, we were outside Mrs. Warren's house. Holmes pointed to one of the houses opposite.
Look, Watson,
He said.
Tall red house with white windows. That's the house in the newspaper message. Now we know the place and the secret code. Our job is easy. Look, there's a to rent sign in the window. It must be an empty flat.
Yes, I'm sure it is, I said, looking at the red house. Holmes rang the bell of Mrs. Warren's house, and she opened the door.
I have everything ready for you,
She said.
Please come up and I'll show you the cupboard.
Thank you, Mrs. Warren,
said Holmes. Holmes and I followed Mrs. Warren upstairs quietly. The cupboard was a very good place to hide. Mrs. Warren put the mirror in a position so that we could see the door of the lodger's rooms. We sat down and waited. Then we heard the lodger ring for lunch, and Mrs. Warren came up with the tray. She put it down on a chair near the closed door and left. We heard her heavy footsteps going down the stairs, and we kept our eyes on the mirror. "When is the lodger going to open the door?" I whispered.
Probably very soon.
Holmes whispered back. Suddenly, we heard the sound of a key opening the door. 2 thin hands came out quickly and took the tray from the chair. But a moment later, the hands put back the tray. I saw a beautiful but frightened face looking at the open door of the cupboard. Then the lodger's door closed quickly and the key turned. Everything was silent again, and we went back downstairs.
I will come back again this evening,
said Holmes to Mrs. Warren.
I think we can discuss this better at Baker Street, Watson.
Chapter 4. Danger,
I was right, Watson.
said Holmes, sitting in his big armchair.
The lodger we just saw is not the man Mrs. Warren knows. It's a beautiful young woman.
Yes, I said, and she saw us,
Well, she saw something that frightened her.
said Holmes.
Everything is a little clearer now, isn't it? A man and a woman come to London to get away from a dangerous situation. The man has some work that he must do and leaves the woman in a safe place. This was not easy, but he had a clever plan, and he hid her well. Not even Mrs. Warren knows who the lodger is. She writes in capital letters because she has a woman's handwriting. She didn't want anyone to know about her. The man cannot come near the woman because their enemies could find her. So he writes messages in the newspapers. So far, everything is clear.
But what is behind this? I asked.
Yes, Watson.
Said Holmes.
What is behind this? Mrs. Warren's problem is bigger than I thought. We saw the young woman's frightened face, and we heard what happened to Mr. Warren. This is a matter of life and death, dear Watson. But the enemy does not know about the change of lodger. It is all very strange.
It was a cold winter evening when we went back to Mrs. Warren's house. We decided to sit in her dark sitting room in front of the big window. From there, we could see a light on the 3rd floor of the red building.
Someone is in that room,
said Holmes, moving closer to the window.
I can see a dark figure. There he is again. He has a candle in his hand and he is looking out of the window. Now he is starting to send a message with the flame of the candle. Let's both try and read the message, Watson. 1 flash. That's an A. Now, how many flashes did he make? 20. Is that right, Watson?
Yes, he made 20 flashes, I said.
That means T. A, T. At. That's clear. And now another T. That's the beginning of a new word. Tenta. He stopped. That can't be the message. At tenta doesn't mean anything. Perhaps it's 3 words. At tenta. Or perhaps ta is part of the person's name. There it goes again. What's that? A, T, T, E. It's the same message again. How strange, Watson. Now he is sending a 3rd message. Attenta. He left the window. I think the message is finished. What do you think, Watson?
I don't know, Holmes, I said. Suddenly, Holmes laughed and said,
Why, of course. The message is in Italian. The A at the end of the word means that the message is for a woman. It means, be careful, be careful, be careful. How's that, Watson?
I think you're right, Holmes, I said.
I'm certain,
said Holmes.
But be careful of what? Wait, he's at the window again.
We saw the dark figure of a man who started sending messages again. This time he sent the message very quickly, and it was difficult to follow it.
Pericolo. What's that, Watson?
Said Holmes.
Isn't that danger in Italian? Yes, of course. It's a danger signal. Look, there he goes again. What happened?
The light went away, and the 3rd floor of the building was dark. The message suddenly stopped. What happened? Holmes and I had the same thought. Holmes jumped up from his chair.
Watson, this is serious,
he cried.
Something terrible is happening. Why did the message stop? I want to call Scotland Yard. But we can't go away now.
What shall we do? I asked.
We need more facts,
said Holmes.
Come on, Watson. Let's go and see what's happening.
Holmes and I walked quickly out to the house and across the street. I looked back at Mrs. Warren's house. On the top floor, I could see a woman's head at the window. She was waiting for the message to continue. There was a man in a dark coat standing at the door of the red building. When he saw us, he called,
Holmes!
Gregson,
said Holmes, looking at the Scotland Yard detective.
why are you here?
I'm here for the same reason you're here,
said Gregson.
How did you find out about this?
In a different way from you,
said Holmes.
I was looking at the signals.
What signals?
Asked Gregson.
The signals from the window.
Said Holmes.
They suddenly stopped, and Watson and I came here to see why. But since the case is in your hands, we can go.
Wait a moment,
cried Gregson.
I always feel better with you with me. There is only one way out from these flats, the front door. So we have him.
Who is he?
Asked Holmes.
You don't know?
Asked Gregson, surprised.
Well, for once I know more than you, Mr. Holmes.
Chapter 5. Giuseppe Gorgiano. Holmes, Gregson and I were standing outside the tall red building. Suddenly, a tall man got out of a cab on the other side of the street and came to us. Mr. Gregson turned to him and said,
Mr. Leverton, this is Sherlock Holmes.
Then he turned to Holmes and said,
This is Mr. Leverton of Pinkerton's Detective Agency in America.
Sir, I am very pleased to meet you,
said Holmes.
You're the hero of several important cases.
The young American became embarrassed at the words of Holmes.
I'm on the most important case of my life now,
said Leverton.
If I can get Gorgiano... What? Gorgiano of the Red Circle?
Asked Holmes.
Oh, is he known in Europe too?
Said Leverton.
Well, we know all about him in America. He's a terrible criminal who killed 50 people, and I want to arrest him. I followed him from New York, and I'm watching him carefully here in London. Mr. Gregson and I followed him to this building. There is only one door here, so he can't get away. 3 men came out of this building after he went in, but he wasn't one of them.
Mr. Holmes talked about signals,
said Gregson.
I'm sure he knows more than we do.
Holmes explained everything we knew to Gregson and Leverton.
Gorgiano knows we're looking for him,
said the American detective.
How do you know?
Asked Holmes.
Well, it seems that way, doesn't it?
Said Leverton.
This evening he sent messages to a member of the Red Circle. There are several members here in London, and they know we're looking for them. What can we do, Mr. Holmes? We must go up at once and see,
said Holmes.
But I can't arrest him,
said Leverton.
I don't have an arrest warrant.
That man is in an empty flat that is not his home,
said Gregson.
That's a good reason to arrest him. Then perhaps the New York police can help us to keep him in prison.
We went into the building, and Leverton ran up the stairs first to arrest the killer. But Gregson wanted to be the first and pushed him back. After all, Gregson was part of the London police, and we were in London. When we got to the 3rd floor, the door of the flat was partly open. Gregson pushed it open, and we all walked in. Everything was dark and silent inside. I lit the detective's lantern, and suddenly we saw something terrible. A lot of blood on the floor. There were red steps on the floor that came from a closed room. Gregson opened the door and held the lantern in front of him. We all looked inside the room. On the floor of the empty room, we saw a very big man with a circle of blood around his head. There was a big knife in his neck and another bigger knife near his hand.
It's Gorgiano,
cried the American detective loudly.
Gorgiano. Someone got here before us.
Here is the candle at the window, Mr. Holmes,
said Gregson.
But what are you doing?
Holmes lit the candle and moved it across the window several times. Then he blew it out and put it down.
I think this will help,
he said, and walked over to the other two men.
Mr. Leverton, you said 3 people came out of the building,
said Holmes.
Did you look at them? Yes, I did,
said Leverton.
Was there a man between 20 and 30 years old with dark hair and a beard?
Asked Holmes.
Yes, there was,
said Leverton.
I think he is your man,
said Holmes.
That is why I called his lady here.
We all turned around when we heard this, and at the door there was a tall, beautiful woman, Mrs. Warren's mysterious lodger. She slowly walked into the room. Her face was white, and her frightened eyes looked at the body of the huge man on the floor. Chapter 6. Emilia's Story. The beautiful young woman stood in the empty room and looked sadly at the body of the dead man. Then she looked at us with her dark eyes.
But are you the police?
She asked.
Yes, we are the police,
said Gregson. She looked around the dark room.
But then, where is Gennaro?
She asked.
Gennaro Lucca is my husband. I am Emilia Lucca, and we come from New York. Where is Gennaro? He just called me from this window and I ran here.
I called you,
said Holmes.
You? How could you call me?
Asked Emilia Lucca.
Your secret code was not difficult, madam,
said Holmes.
We needed you here, so I flashed Vieni at the window.
The beautiful Italian woman looked at Holmes with surprise.
I do not understand how you know these things,
she said.
Giuseppe Gorgiano, how did he...
She stopped and then suddenly said,
Now I understand. Gennaro killed this monster with his strong hands.
Well, Mrs. Lucca,
said Gregson, putting his hand on her arm.
I don't really know who you are or what you are, but you know a lot about this case. Please come to Scotland Yard with me.
One moment, Gregson,
said Holmes.
I think this lady has several important things to tell us.
Holmes turned to Mrs. Lucca and said,
Madam, your husband will be arrested for killing this man. What Gennaro did is very wrong. Do you understand this?
Now that Gorgiano is dead, we are afraid of nothing,
said Mrs. Lucca.
He was a terrible monster. But I know Gennaro did the wrong thing. Killing is always wrong.
She was silent for a moment, and her dark eyes were sad.
If I tell you the whole story, perhaps you will understand why my husband killed him.
Very well,
said Holmes.
Let's close this door and leave everything here. We can go with this lady to her room and listen to her story.
We all went back to Mrs. Warren's house. Half an hour later, we were sitting in Mrs. Lucca's small sitting room. She started telling us her unusual story. She spoke very quickly, but her English was not good.
I was born in Posillipo, near the city of Naples, Italy,
she said.
I am the daughter of Augusto Barelli, a very important man. Gennaro worked for my father, and I loved him. He was poor, but he was handsome and kind. My father did not let me marry him, so we ran away together. We got married in another city. Then I sold my jewels to get the money to go to America. We went to New York City 4 years ago and stayed there. There were a lot of Italians in New York and we liked it. At first everything went well. Gennaro helped an Italian gentleman called Tito Castalotte and became his good friend. Mr. Castalotte owns a big company in New York and more than 300 men work for him. He gave Gennaro an important job in his company and was always kind to him. Mr. Castalotte was not married and Gennaro was like a son to him. We both loved him like a father. Gennaro and I rented a small house in Brooklyn and we were happy together. Then one evening, Gennaro brought an Italian man home with him. His name was Giuseppe Gorgiano, and he was from Posillipo too. He was so big, as you know. Everything about him was big and frightening. His voice was loud and he moved his enormous arms about when he talked. He was too big for our little house. He never stopped talking with his loud, angry voice. He came to our house again and again. Gennaro was unhappy when Gorgiano was at our house, but he sat and listened to Gorgiano talk. He was a very bad man, and he was always angry.
We were all listening carefully to Mrs. Luca's long story.
I knew something was wrong. My poor Gennaro was terribly afraid of him. One night, Gennaro told me his long story, and I became very sad. When Gennaro was young, he was poor, and the world was against him. He became a member of a secret society in Naples called the Red Circle. It was part of the old Carbonari, and it did terrible things. The members of this secret society had to follow the rules and could not leave it. When we went to America, Gennaro was happy because he was far from Naples and the Red Circle. He wanted to forget about it. But one evening, he met a member of the Red Circle in New York. It was Giuseppe Gorgiano. In the south of Italy, people called him Death because he was a terrible killer. He went to New York because the Italian police wanted to arrest him. And in his new city, he started the Red Circle again.
Chapter 7. The Red Circle. Mrs. Luca continued her story, and we all listened.
One evening, Gennaro showed me a letter from Gorgiano with a red circle at the top. It said there was an important meeting on a certain day, and Gennaro had to go. This was terrible, but then something worse happened. Gorgiano always came to see us in the evening. He talked to me a lot and I did not like it. He always looked at me with his big, ugly eyes. I did not know what to do. Then one night, Gorgiano came to our house when I was alone. Gennaro was still at work, and Gorgiano told me his secret. He loved me. He took me in his huge arms and kissed me. It was terrible and I screamed. At that moment, Gennaro came home and tried to help me. He and Gorgiano fought a lot and Gorgiano knocked him down and ran away. He never came back to our house. Gorgiano became our dangerous enemy.
Mrs. Luca stopped for a moment and looked at us with sad eyes. Then she continued.
A few days later, there was the meeting of the Red Circle and Gennaro had to go. When he came back, his face was white. To get money, the secret society blackmailed rich Italians who lived in New York. The Red Circle did terrible things to the Italians who did not pay. It even killed them. The Red Circle sent a letter to our friend, Tito Castalotte, and told him to pay. He was frightened and angry and told the New York police about Gorgiano and the Red Circle. Gorgiano was very angry and decided to blow up Castalotte's house. The members of the Red Circle chose Gennaro to do it. He had to kill his best friend. My poor Gennaro was terrified. He is a good man. He is not a killer. He looked at me and said, "If I don't kill Castalotte, Gorgiano will kill us." It was a terrible night. Gennaro and I were very, very afraid. We could not sleep and we did not know what to do. We talked all night about Gorgiano, the Red Circle, Castalotte, and all of the problems we had. Finally, we decided it was too dangerous to stay in New York, and we had to leave immediately. But where could we go? I wanted to go back to Posilippo, but Gennaro said that it was not possible. There were too many of Gorgiano's friends and other Red Circle members there. So we decided to leave for London, because it is a big city and we know no one. We left early the next morning, before the sun came up. We didn't bring anything with us, only clothes and documents, because we didn't want anyone to realize we were leaving. We went to the port, but before we sent messages to both Castalotte and the police to tell them about Gorgiano's terrible plan. Well, gentlemen, you already know the rest of the story. Gorgiano followed us to London, and Gennaro found a place for me to hide. He wanted to go and talk to the Italian police. I never saw my husband during this time. I don't know where he lived or what he did. The only news from Gennaro were the messages in the newspaper. Then one day from the window I saw two Italians in the street. It was Gorgiano and another man. They were watching the house. I was alone and frightened. I read Gennaro's messages in the newspaper. I waited at the window for his signals and saw them. I knew there was great danger because Gorgiano was near. Fortunately, Gennaro was ready for him when he came. Now, gentlemen, you know the whole story. A long and sad one.
Well, Mr. Gregson,
said the American detective.
now we know the whole story. What do you think?
Gennaro Luca killed a man. Mrs. Luca has to come with me to Scotland Yard,
said Gregson.
The chief of police has to hear her story and talk to her husband. Then he'll decide what to do.
Well, Watson,
said Holmes.
I think our work is done, and it's time to go.
He turned to Emilia and to the other men and said,
Good evening, everyone.
Holmes and I got up, put on our coats, and left. It was a cold night as we walked out of Mrs. Warren's house.
Police and detectives in the 19th century. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a lot of crime in London. The city was crowded and criminals could hide easily. It was often not safe to walk down the dark streets. In 1829, Sir Robert Bobby Peel, 1788 to 1850, started the London Metropolitan Police at Scotland Yard. It was the world's first modern police force with around 1,000 men. The police wore uniforms and were known as Peelers or Bobbies, both because of Robert Peel's name. The work of the police was to stop crime in the city streets. At first, the people of London did not like the police. But when there was less crime in the city, they started to understand that the police were important. After 1856, there were police forces all over Great Britain. The Metropolitan Police Force became a model for the New York City Police in 1850 and for other police forces around the world. In 1842, the first detective department was started at Scotland Yard. It had only 2 inspectors and 6 sergeants. Detectives did not wear uniforms and they investigated more complicated crimes. In 1878, the Detective Department became the Criminal Investigation Department, CID. Mr. Gregson, in the Red Circle, worked for this department. In the Red Circle, Mr. Leverton worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency in the United States. This agency was created by Alan Pinkerton in Chicago in 1850, and today it is the oldest in America. Alan Pinkerton became famous when he discovered a plan to kill President-elect Abraham Lincoln. During the American Civil War, President Lincoln used Pinkerton detectives to protect himself and his family. Sometimes detectives did not do a good job and made a lot of mistakes. Other times it took them months to solve a case. And at times they never solved the case. Some people paid a private detective, like the character of Sherlock Holmes, to solve difficult cases. In Conan Doyle's stories, Sherlock Holmes solved cases with modern scientific methods called forensic methods. He used chemical analysis, microscopes, fingerprints, photographs, studies of handwriting, and footprints. In real life, detectives did not use these methods yet. In 1901, Scotland Yard started using fingerprints to solve cases. Victorian writers. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle started writing his stories about Sherlock Holmes in the late 19th century, during Victorian times. A lot of Britain's greatest writers wrote at this time, and this inspired him. During the 19th century, educational possibilities were slowly getting better, and more people were learning to read and write. Without the radio, cinema, or television, reading was the favourite type of entertainment. People loved reading novels, newspapers, magazines, academic books, and even comics. In the 1850s, the government started building public libraries in towns and cities all over Great Britain. Books were too expensive to buy for most people, but in these new libraries, more people had the possibility to read a lot of different books. The Daily Telegraph, started in 1855, became the first penny paper. The paper was a big success and quickly became the best-selling newspaper. Because of this, more and more people could read the newspaper every day. The first children's comics, with funny cartoons and adventures, also came out in the 1850s, and children had great fun reading them. In Victorian times, novels were sometimes published in chapters in magazines and newspapers. Every week or month, people could read a new chapter of a story. This continued for months, and sometimes years, until the story was finished. As a result of all these changes, some authors became very popular. Here are some of them. Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. As a child, Charles Dickens was poor. He left school at a young age to work in a factory for long hours. He never forgot this bad experience. His first novel was The Pickwick Papers, 1837, and it was a success. He wrote 14 important novels, including Oliver Twist, 1839, and David Copperfield, 1849 to 1850. He wrote about the poor people and the social problems at that time. Anna Sewell, 1820 to 1878. In 1877, Anna Sewell wrote Black Beauty. It was about the life and adventures of a horse. After reading this book, people began to understand that animals were living creatures, and it was wrong to mistreat them. Wilkie Collins, 1824 to 1889. In 1868, Wilkie Collins published The Moonstone with one of the first detectives in English fiction, Sergeant Cuff. The novel became very popular, and people started reading detective fiction. Lewis Carroll, 1832 to 1898. Lewis Carroll wrote the first fantasy story for children, called Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, 1865. It was a bestseller. Victorian children loved the book with its exciting adventures and beautiful illustrations by Sir John Tenniel. Robert Louis Stevenson, 1850 to 1894. In 1883, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote a great adventure book for young people called Treasure Island. It was about a young boy's adventures with pirates at sea. He also wrote other adventure stories, like Kidnapped, 1886, and The Black Arrow, 1888. Rudyard Kipling, 1865 to 1936. Rudyard Kipling wrote The Jungle Book, 1894, The Second Jungle Book, 1895, and Just So Stories, 1902. They were very popular with children. Most of the characters of these books were animals.